At a high-end restaurant in New York, a millionaire runs his empire with cold precision. But his carefully controlled world shifts when he notices a homeless black boy selling cookies on the sidewalk. Boy's pride unshaken despite rejection. Curious, he invites the boy and his mother to dinner, unaware that this simple act will unearth a past he thought was long buried. The moment the woman steps through the door, her face stops him cold. She is the very person who once changed his life. The city lights of New York flickered through the towering glass windows of Harrison's Prime, casting a golden glow over the elegant dining room. It was a restaurant built for those who mattered: the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who expected nothing but the finest. William Will Harrison, its owner and a self-made millionaire, strode through the floor with the effortless confidence of a man who controlled everything in his domain. He was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, every detail immaculate, from the pristine white pocket square to the polished leather shoes. Success wasn't just something he had achieved, it was something he wore. As he surveyed the dining hall, his sharp blue eyes flicked over the guests, nodding slightly at a few familiar faces. Investors, CEOs, old money elites. They dined beneath crystal chandeliers, sipping expensive wine, indulging in a world where struggle was something that happened to other people. Will had fought tooth and nail to be here, to carve out his empire, and he had no patience for those who hadn't done the same. A sudden movement outside the restaurant's glass doors caught his attention. A boy young, no older than 11 or 12, stood on the sidewalk, clutching a small, tattered box against his chest. His clothes were worn, his shoes barely holding together, but his back was straight, his posture defiant. He wasn't begging. He was selling. Through the hum of conversation and the clinking of fine china, Will could barely hear the boy's muffled voice as he approached passersby, offering something from his box. Most ignored him entirely, some waved him off with a disgusted look. At that moment, Samuel Whitmore, the restaurant's head of security, stepped forward, his posture stiff, professional, but with an unmistakable edge of disdain. He was a large, broad-shouldered man, a former cop with the typical hard-nosed, no-nonsense demeanor of someone who saw certain people as problems to be handled, not individuals to be understood. He adjusted the gold cufflinks on his sleeves before opening the door, his voice sharp, clipped. "Hey, move along, kid. You can't stand here. This isn't your kind of place." The boy flinched but didn't back down. His dark eyes locked onto Whitmore's, steady and fearless. "I'm not begging. I'm selling." His voice was firm, unshaken, the kind that came from someone who had long accepted that life wasn't fair but refused to let it break him. Whitmore scoffed. "Selling what?" "Bad decisions. Welfare dreams." He stepped forward, blocking the entrance entirely, towering over the boy. "I said move." Will watched the scene unfold, something tightening in his chest. He had seen this play out before. A certain type of person always seemed to attract a certain type of response. He had worked too hard, too long, to pretend otherwise. His past was buried beneath years of wealth, of control, but in that instant, something surfaced, something raw. He didn't like it. He wasn't sentimental. He didn't do charity. And yet he was already walking toward the entrance before he could think better of it. "That's enough, Sam." Will's voice was smooth, authoritative, cutting through the tension with the ease of a man who expected to be obeyed. Whitmore hesitated, glancing at him with mild surprise. "Sir, this kid's disturbing the guests. You know how it is, starts with one. Then suddenly we've got a whole damn shelter outside." Will's gaze was cold. "Did I ask for a lecture on urban sociology, or did I tell you to stop?" The air between them shifted. Whitmore clenched his jaw but took a step back. Even men like him knew when they had crossed the line with the wrong person. Will turned his attention to the boy. Up close he was lean, his hands gripping the box tightly, as if afraid someone might snatch it away. His face was young but marked with the kind of resilience that only came from surviving things no child should have to. "You're selling something?" Will asked, his tone unreadable. The boy nodded cautiously. "Homemade cookies. My mom makes them. She's sick, so I help." There was no plea in his voice, no attempt at sympathy. Just a statement of fact. Will glanced at the box, then at the kid's face. He saw something there, something that reminded him of himself, long ago. He exhaled through his nose, half amused, half irritated at himself for even entertaining this. How about a trade? The boy frowned. I don't take handouts. Will almost laughed. Of course you don't. Not a handout, he said. A deal. You bring your mom here tomorrow. I'll buy a meal for both of you. In exchange, you bring me a fresh batch of whatever you're selling. The boy hesitated. His fingers tapped against the side of the box, calculating. Suspicious, but interested. I don't know, he admitted. People don't usually mean what they say. Will smirked. I'm not most people. A beat of silence. Then, slowly, the boy nodded. Okay. Will pulled out his wallet, taking $100 bill and sliding it into the box. The boy's eyes widened slightly. For the cookies, Will said simply, and I expect them to be good. The kid blinked, then smirked a rare, fleeting thing before tightening his grip on the box. They will be. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark streets. Will exhaled, shaking his head slightly, turning back toward the restaurant. As he stepped inside, Whitmore was watching him carefully, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp with something unspoken. Don't tell me you're going soft, sir, Whitmore muttered under his breath. Will glanced at him, his expression cool. No, just bored. But as he walked back through the dining room, the polished chandeliers reflecting the perfection of the world he had built, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just invited something unfinished back into his life. The next evening, Harrison's Prime was alive with its usual grandeur. Waiters moved in synchronized precision. Glasses clinked with measured elegance, and the scent of dry aged steak and truffle-laced pastas filled the air. William Harrison stood near the bar, casually swirling a glass of scotch, though his eyes were elsewhere. He wasn't waiting for a guest of importance. At least, not by society's standards. He told himself it was nothing, that last night had just been a passing indulgence in curiosity. But curiosity had an annoying way of becoming something more. Then the door opened. The boy walked in first, his posture stiff, wary. Caleb Reed was dressed in the same worn clothes, though his hands were now empty. No box, no cookies, just a quiet tension in his shoulders. Behind him, a woman followed, stepping carefully inside as if she didn't quite belong. And in this world, she didn't. Evelyn Reed. Will's fingers tightened around his glass. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Caleb had said it yesterday, but the sight of her made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. She was older. Yes, her features lined with exhaustion, but there was something unmistakable in the way she carried herself, dignified, composed, like someone who had spent a lifetime fighting battles no one ever saw. Her dark brown eyes scanned the restaurant with the quiet wariness of someone who had been turned away too many times to count. She had no idea who he was. For a split second, Will considered walking away, telling a waiter to handle them, letting this remain what it was supposed to be, an insignificant moment in his otherwise meticulously controlled life. But instead he set down his drink and strode toward them, his polished shoes soundless against the marble floor. You came, he said simply, watching as Caleb squared his shoulders like a bodyguard standing between him and his mother. I wasn't sure if you actually meant it, the boy admitted, his voice edged with suspicion. I don't say things I don't mean, Will replied, then shifted his gaze to Evelyn. She was studying him now, her expression unreadable. Thank you for inviting us, Mr. Harrison, she said, her voice softer than he expected, polite but distant, like she was bracing herself for something unpleasant. She doesn't recognize me. Good. This way, he said, leading them to a table near the back, more private than the others, away from the hushed whispers of patrons who had already noticed their presence. He could feel it, the shift in energy, the looks, the silent judgment. A woman like her, in a place like this. There would be murmurs, assumptions. Some of them, no doubt, from the kind of people who claimed they weren't racist but still thought places like this weren't meant for certain types. Whitmore was already watching from his post near the entrance, arms crossed, his gaze lingering just a little too long, waiting for an excuse. Will ignored him. They sat, and within seconds, a waiter appeared, though Will caught the flicker of hesitation in his movement, polite, but forced. He set down menace, then turned to Will, as if asking for permission to continue. Whatever they want, Will said flatly. Caleb hesitated, eyeing his mother. Evelyn exhaled softly, lowering the menu. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not here to take advantage of your generosity. It's not generosity. It's a transaction, Will corrected, watching as her brows furrowed. Your son held up his end of the deal. I hold up mine. A pause. Then, slowly, she nodded. Caleb, emboldened, scanned the menu, eyes widening slightly at the options. He had probably never seen half the dishes listed, never even imagined food could cost so much. Will could tell he was hesitating not out of uncertainty, but out of instinctual caution, the kind you develop when you've had to ration meals, when you know luxury is never free. You don't have to choose the cheapest thing, Will said, and Caleb's gaze flicked to him, assessing. I wasn't going to, the boy shot back, and for the first time Will smirked. The order was placed. The waiter left. Silence settled. Will leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers once against the table. So, your son says you make cookies. Evelyn blinked at him, clearly thrown off by the sudden shift. Yes, she said after a moment. Good ones? The best, Caleb answered before she could, his voice filled with certainty. Will arched a brow. That's so. Evelyn exhaled a small laugh, shaking her head. I'd like to think so. It was something I used to do a lot, before things changed. Before things changed. Will could have asked what she meant, could have prodded at the pieces of her story she wasn't saying, but he already knew. He didn't need her to explain what it meant to have the ground pulled out from beneath you, to lose what little stability you had. He had lived it. What happened? He asked instead, more to himself than anything. Evelyn hesitated. Then, slowly, she sighed. My husband passed. It left us in a situation we couldn't get out of. It's been one thing after another since then. And no one helped. She smiled, but it wasn't a happy one. People like us don't get help, Mr. Harrison. We get tolerated if we're lucky. Something about the way she said it settled deep in Will's chest, a weight pressing down against something he had long since locked away. Before he could respond, the waiter returned with their meals, setting them down with a careful precision that felt more forced than usual. Will barely noticed. He watched as Caleb picked up his fork, took a cautious bite, then another, his guard lowering for the first time since stepping into the restaurant. This is really good, the boy admitted, as if it physically pained him to say something nice. Will smirked. Wouldn't be the best if it wasn't. Evelyn, however, was still watching him carefully, and for a brief second he saw a flicker of recognition, of something just out of reach. She didn't know yet, but something inside her was starting to remember. Will exhaled slowly, forcing himself to look away, to focus on the drink in his hand, on the swirl of amber liquid catching the light. Tomorrow they'd be gone. Tomorrow this wouldn't matter. Tomorrow he could forget he ever saw her. But something in his gut told him that was a lie. The meal continued, the air shifting into something more comfortable, though not entirely free of tension. Evelyn ate carefully, her posture still poised, her movements deliberate, as if she was waiting for the moment someone would remind her that she didn't belong here. Caleb, however, had eased into the experience, savoring every bite in a way that told Will this wasn't just a good meal, it was a rare one. He caught the way the boy glanced at his mother between bites, making sure she was eating too, as if it was second nature for him to put her first. Will knew that instinct well. He swirled his drink, keeping his expression unreadable, but inside, something churned. He told himself it was nothing, that this dinner was exactly what it had been meant to be, a one-time gesture, a deal fulfilled, and nothing more. But as he watched Evelyn tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the dim light catching against her tired eyes, a memory clawed its way out of the past, one he had buried beneath years of success and carefully curated distance. A cold night. A cheap, overstuffed shelter kitchen. The smell of bread baking, warm against the bite of winter air, and a woman not much older than Evelyn was now handing him a plate of food with a quiet smile. Eat, she had said. No one should have to fight this world on an empty stomach. He had been a different person then, hardened, suspicious, convinced that nothing came without a price, but she hadn't asked for anything. His fingers tightened around the glass. That woman had been Evelyn. The realization settled into his chest like a weight, pressing against his ribs, constricting something in his throat. She had saved him once. Given him a meal when he had been just like Caleb, angry, hungry, unwilling to trust anyone who claimed to be offering kindness. She had been the only person who had ever looked at him and seen something more than a lost cause. And she had no idea. Will's grip on the glass loosened as he forced himself to exhale, to smooth the edges of his expression before either of them noticed the way his entire foundation had just shifted. He had spent years carving out a life where he owed no one, where no part of his past could touch him. But now, sitting across from the woman who had unknowingly set him on the path that led him here, the past wasn't just touching him, it was staring him right in the face. "So," he said, his voice measured, controlled, "what happened to the bakery?" Evelyn looked up, caught off guard by the question. She hesitated, then offered a small, tired smile. "You did your research on us." "I don't make deals without knowing who I'm dealing with," he replied smoothly, even though it was a lie. He hadn't looked into them at all. He didn't need to. She set her fork down carefully, fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. "It was never really mine, not officially. I worked there, saved up, had plans to maybe take it over one day. But when my husband passed, everything unraveled faster than I could hold it together. Bills, medical debt, the kind of things that don't wait for you to get back on your feet." Her voice remained even. But there was something underneath it, something heavy. "I tried. But trying doesn't always mean much when the world's already decided you've lost." Will's jaw tensed. He knew that truth intimately. And no one helped. Evelyn exhaled, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping her lips. People help when they think it'll make them look good. The kind of help that comes with cameras, with reporters waiting for the heartwarming moment. But real help? No, not for people like me. People like me. He didn't miss the way she said it, the weight behind it. She had been fighting battles long before she lost her husband. Battles Will had stopped fighting the second he stopped being on the losing side. The air felt heavier now. It wasn't just dinner anymore. Caleb, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing between them, set his fork down and looked at Will directly. "So, what do you even do exactly? I mean, besides telling people what to cook?" Will huffed a short laugh, grateful for the shift. "I own a few restaurants." "Like this one?" "Like this one," Will confirmed. Caleb tilted his head. "Then why do you look like you'd rather be anywhere else?" Evelyn let out a quiet gasp. "Caleb." But Will only smirked. "You don't hold back, do you?" Caleb shrugged, unapologetic. "Just saying. You don't talk like someone who actually enjoys what he does." Will swirled his drink, considering. He could deflect, could give some polished answer about the thrill of success, the satisfaction of building an empire, but it would be a lie. "I enjoy winning," he admitted. "That's enough." Caleb frowned but didn't press. Evelyn, however, was still watching him carefully, her expression unreadable, and then there it was. A flicker. A shift. She saw something. It wasn't full recognition, not yet, but he saw the way her brows furrowed slightly, the way her eyes narrowed just enough, like something at the edge of her memory was whispering to her, asking her to look a little closer. Will forced himself to hold her gaze, not to flinch under the weight of it. "Have we met before?" Evelyn asked suddenly. The question hit him harder than it should have. He could lie. It would be easy. A simple "I don't think so," and this conversation would move on, would stay exactly where it needed to on the surface. But the moment hung between them, heavy, expectant. And for the first time in years, Will hesitated. The answer sat on the tip of his tongue, an admission waiting to be spoken. "Yes, we have. You gave me food when I had nothing. You were the only person who ever looked at me like I was worth something before I had the power to prove it." But he wasn't that boy anymore. And she didn't need to know. So he smirked, leaning back in his chair with practiced ease, the mask slipping effortlessly back into place. "I doubt it. I think I'd remember someone like you." Evelyn studied him for a moment longer, and then, finally, she let it go. But as she turned her attention back to Caleb, continuing some conversation he only half registered, Will's fingers tapped lightly against the side of his glass. Because now, the question wasn't whether she remembered him. The question was whether he wanted her to. The night deepened, the murmur of conversation in Harrison's prime fading into the background as the weight of something unspoken settled over the table. Evelyn was watching him, not in the polite, distant way she had before, but with quiet, lingering curiosity like a puzzle she was beginning to piece together. Will could feel it, the slow unraveling, the shift in her expression every time he spoke. She didn't know yet, not fully, but the suspicion was there, simmering just beneath the surface. And that was dangerous. Will had spent years burying the past beneath success, beneath power, beneath carefully curated distance from the boy he used to be. He had built a world where he owed nothing to anyone, where no trace of where he came from could ever touch him again. But now, the one person who had once shown him kindness without asking for anything in return was sitting across from him, and she was beginning to remember. "You look like someone who doesn't like being figured out." Evelyn's voice was soft but firm, cutting through his thoughts with ease. Will lifted a brow, feigning amusement. "And what exactly do you think you're figuring out?" She hesitated, fingers tracing the stem of her water glass. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But something about you feels familiar." Familiar. The word coiled around him, too close, too dangerous. He forced a smirk, leaning back in his chair, tilting his glass just slightly. Deflection. Control. Keep the game on his terms. "I'd take that as a compliment if I didn't think you meant it as an accusation." Evelyn shook her head, a quiet laugh escaping her lips, but there was something sharp in her gaze now, something cutting through his carefully constructed detachment. Not an accusation, just an observation. Caleb, still chewing the last bites of his meal, glanced between them, picking up on something unspoken but not fully understanding it. That was good. Will needed the boy to stay out of this. "Well, if you ever figure it out, let me know," Will said smoothly, setting his glass down with a quiet clink against the table. Evelyn exhaled, shaking her head as if she had already decided she wouldn't get anything more out of him tonight. "You're a hard man to read, Mr. Harrison." "That's intentional." She studied him a moment longer, then finally let it go, turning back to Caleb, asking if he had enough to eat. The boy nodded, though his gaze flicked toward Will briefly before dropping back to his plate. Will should have left it at that. The meal was done. The debt, if he could even call it that, was repaid. He could stand, hand Evelyn his card, tell her to come back if she ever needed work, and that would be the end of it. But he didn't. Instead, before he could think better of it, he said something he shouldn't have. "You said earlier that people like you don't get help." His voice was calm, measured, but something about it made Evelyn's shoulders stiffen slightly. "Do you actually believe that? Or is that just something you tell yourself so it hurts less when it's true?" Silence. A slow, almost imperceptible shift. Then Evelyn laughed. But it wasn't humor. It was something dry, something exhausted, something that sounded like it had been earned through years of disappointment. "It's not something I tell myself, Mr. Harrison. It's something I've seen." She exhaled, shaking her head slightly, her fingers tightening around her napkin. "You think I don't know what people see when they look at me?" A black woman, past her prime, too tired to be useful, too proud to be pitied. "You think I don't know the looks, the dismissals, the way the world treats people like me like we're disposable." She wasn't raising her voice, but she didn't have to. The weight of every word pressed into the space between them, sharp and precise, cutting through the carefully maintained atmosphere of the restaurant like a blade. Will held her gaze, expression unreadable, but his fingers curled slightly against the table. "People don't help people like me, Mr. Harrison. Not unless there's something in it for them. And that's fine. I don't expect otherwise. But don't ask me if I believe it. I don't have the luxury of pretending it's not true." Caleb shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable, but not because his mother was wrong, because she was right. Will should have been unaffected. He should have let it pass, should have let it be just another moment, another truth that didn't concern him. But something about the way she said it, the certainty, the quiet, exhausted resignation of it dug under his skin in a way nothing else had in years. Because once, a long time ago, he had believed it too. "Not everyone sees it that way," he said finally, though his voice was quieter now, as if the conversation had stopped being about her and had somehow, without him meaning to, become about himself. Evelyn studied him, something unreadable in her gaze. Then she sighed, shaking her head, as if she had already made peace with whatever answer she had been looking for. Maybe not, but the ones who don't have to. Will felt the impact of that in his chest, something cold, something sharp, something dangerously close to recognition. She wasn't talking about him. She didn't know who he had been, didn't know that once he had sat in a shelter kitchen just like Caleb, staring down at a plate of food handed to him by a woman who hadn't asked him for anything in return. She didn't know. But somehow she still did. A long, tense beat passed between them. Then Caleb pushed his plate away slightly, breaking the silence. "That was the best food I've ever had," he admitted, almost begrudgingly. Will let out a short breath, smirking. "You must have had a terrible life then." The boy huffed. "I'm serious." "So am I." Caleb rolled his eyes, but there was something lighter in his expression now, something that said he had begun to understand Will in a way he hadn't before. Not as a rich man, not as some untouchable figure, but as someone who wasn't entirely different from him. Evelyn, however, was still watching Will carefully, and for a split second he thought she was going to ask again, ask if they had met before, ask why he looked at her like he knew something she didn't. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened, setting her napkin down beside her plate. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Harrison, but we should be going." Will could have let her, could have watched them leave and never looked back. But then he found himself saying something he hadn't planned. "You should come back." Evelyn blinked, thrown off. "Excuse me?" "You need a job." He said it casually, as if it wasn't the most reckless thing he'd done in years. "I need good people in my kitchen. If the cookies are as good as you claim, it could be worth something." Caleb's eyes widened slightly. Evelyn, however, just studied him, her expression unreadable. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you an opportunity." Another long pause. Then, finally, Evelyn let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "And here I thought you didn't do charity, Mr. Harrison." "I don't," Will said evenly. "I do business, and I don't hire people who can't hold their own. So if you think you can't keep up, let's not waste each other's time." Caleb glanced at his mother, waiting. Evelyn exhaled, shaking her head slightly, but something in her eyes had changed. "I'll think about it." Will smirked. "You do that." She nodded once, then stood, motioning for Caleb to follow. They left without another word, disappearing into the night. Will exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He had just done something irreversible, and he wasn't entirely sure why. A week passed before she came back. Will hadn't expected her to. He told himself he didn't care. That offering Evelyn Reed a job had been nothing more than a practical decision. If she could bake as well as Caleb claimed, she was an asset, and that was the only reason he had made the offer. But he knew that was a lie. He had done it because something about her refusal to bend, to beg, to be grateful in a way people like him expected from people like her, had unsettled him. It reminded him of who he used to be, who he had to be to survive. So when he walked into the kitchen at Harrison's prime and saw her standing there, hands clasped in front of her, dressed in a simple, clean blouse and slacks that still carried the faintest signs of wear, he felt something shift inside him. She met his gaze, unwavering. "You said you don't do charity, so don't treat this like one." Will smirked. "I don't hire people who need favors. I hire people who can do the job." He crossed his arms, nodding toward the counter. "Show me what you've got." She did. And it was damn good. By the time the first batch of cookies came out of the oven, the scent alone had drawn in half the kitchen staff. A sauce chef took a bite and nearly cursed. Another asked if she had ever worked in fine dining before. Evelyn just smiled, shaking her head, but there was something almost cautious in her expression, like she was waiting for Will to say something, to either approve or dismiss her. He took a bite, chewed slowly, let the silence stretch long enough for her to wonder if he was going to find a flaw. But there was none. The cookie was perfect, rich, balanced, the kind of thing that made people nostalgic for something they couldn't quite name. It tasted like home. "You start Monday," he said finally, tossing the rest of the cookie back onto the plate. For the first time, Evelyn looked surprised. "That's it?" "That's it." She hesitated, searching his face for something. But Will had already turned away, barking orders at the staff like this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But as he walked back toward his office, he felt her watching him. And he wondered if she had just unknowingly stepped back into his life, or if he had just stepped back into hers. Months passed, and something shifted within the walls of Harrison's prime. It wasn't overnight, but it was undeniable. Evelyn settled into the rhythm of the kitchen, proving herself again and again until no one questioned her place there. She wasn't just the woman Will had given a job to, she became someone the staff respected. Her pastries sold out every night. Regulars asked for them by name. And Caleb, he thrived. At first he had been skeptical, watching Will with the kind of measured wariness that came from a life spent waiting for people to take back their promises. But slowly he softened. He started coming in after school, first just to help his mother, then to help around the restaurant, then eventually because he wanted to. He lingered in the kitchen, watching the chefs, asking questions. One night, Will found him standing over a prep station, knife in hand, carefully slicing herbs under the watchful eye of the sus chef. "You thinking about sticking around?" Will had asked. Caleb had just shrugged. "It's better than being out there." And Will had understood exactly what he meant. But even as the restaurant changed, even as Caleb grew into something more than a street kid with a box of cookies, Evelyn still hadn't figured it out. She watched Will sometimes, eyes narrowed in quiet contemplation, the recognition always just out of reach. She felt it. He knew she did. She just hadn't put the pieces together yet. Until the night she did. It had been a long evening, the restaurant buzzing with energy, the kitchen pushing out plates with seamless precision. Evelyn had stayed late, finishing a batch of pastries for the next day. Will had walked in, expecting her to have already left, but instead he found her standing near the counter, staring at a plate of cookies like she wasn't really seeing them. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. "I remember now." Will stilled. "It took me a while," she continued, her voice quiet but steady, a certainty settling into her words that hadn't been there before. "But I remember." She took a step closer, searching his face, and for the first time he didn't try to stop her from seeing it. "You were just a kid," she whispered. "You sat in my kitchen, wouldn't talk to anyone, wouldn't even tell me your name, but I remember your face. And I remember how hungry you were." Will exhaled slowly, a sharp, measured breath. He could lie. He could shake his head, dismiss it, tell her she was mistaken. But he didn't. Because she was right. And suddenly, it didn't matter that he had spent years pretending that part of him didn't exist. Because in this moment, standing in the kitchen of the restaurant he built, staring at the woman who had once handed him food when he had nothing, he wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't an empire. He was just a boy who had been saved by a stranger. "Yeah," he admitted finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "That was me." Evelyn's breath hitched. "Will." But he shook his head, swallowing hard. "Don't say it." Her eyes softened. "I'm proud of you." Will turned away, staring down at the counter, pressing his hands against the cool marble. He had spent years clawing his way out of that past, out of that hunger, out of that version of himself that had needed help. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he had failed by needing it. Because maybe, just maybe, it had brought him here. And for the first time in his life, that didn't feel like a weakness. The first night of the restaurant's community dinner was a quiet success. No press, no cameras, no grand speeches, just food. Evelyn cooked. Will watched. And Caleb served. The boy moved between tables, handing out plates, smiling when people thanked him. He didn't look like a kid trying to survive anymore. He looked like someone who belonged. Will leaned against the bar, watching as Evelyn ruffled her son's hair, watching as a woman and her child sat at a table and ate without worrying where their next meal would come from. "You're not as heartless as you like people to think," Evelyn murmured beside him. Will smirked, lifting his drink. "Don't tell anyone. Might ruin my reputation." She huffed a soft laugh, shaking her head. Too late. He glanced at her, then back at Caleb, watching as the boy spoke with another kid around his age, a girl who looked like she hadn't had a full meal in days. Caleb grinned. And Will felt something settle inside him, something quiet, something steady. "Why are you really doing this?" Evelyn asked, watching him carefully. Will exhaled, tilting his glass slightly, watching the amber liquid swirl in the dim light. "Because someone once did it for me." Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.